Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Anna Cloud. I will be supporting with tech on the back end. So if you have any questions, feel free to message me. A couple of things before we get started. This meeting is being recorded for notes and for colleagues unable to attend. We will be breaking up this presentation with periods of Q&A. During these times, please feel free to raise your hand with those Zoom reactions to ask your questions live. You can also post your questions and comments in the chat at any time. We are excited to hear from you throughout the session, and we would love it if you could kick things off by introducing yourself in the chat. Thanks again for your participation, and I will pass it off to Jasmine Ohanyeri, Feed the Future Team Lead in the Office of Economic Growth and Environment for USAID Nigeria and Mission, focal point for the Feed the Future activities in Northeast Nigeria, and are the focus of the study.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anna. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone who is here. I want to express my gratitude to the Tango team for giving me the opportunity to provide brief remarks as we gather to observe the resilience evaluation, analysis, and learning real results for round 3 of the study. As the Feed the Future team lead and the AOR for the Rural Resilience activity, I recognize the importance of this evaluation for our current and future programming here in Nigeria. The analysis is delving into our resilience interventions, has been instrumental in helping us learn and adapt our current initiatives and develop new resilience activities to inform our strategies, which aim to mitigate the negative impacts of shocks and stresses, address humanitarian needs, and improve well-being amid a conflict-driven proactive crisis. As we finalize our new Global Food Security Country Plan here at USAID Nigeria, we aim to demonstrate our ability to manage a complex and compounding risk environment. Our approach involves leveraging networks through the development of democracy, interagency and government partnerships, private sector engagement, and inclusive development. These connected efforts aim to maximize our sustainable impact and advance the well-being of Nigerians in the fight against hunger, poverty, and malnutrition. Tango's evaluation will provide valuable insight to address Nigeria's challenging risk environments. Climate risks, such as devastating floods and persistent droughts, coupled with external factors like the Russia invasion on Ukraine, it has amplified domestic challenges ranging from the currency crisis to fuel, fertilizer, and food availability. While new shocks will inevitably emerge, the evaluation will aid us in strengthening our preparativeness in responding. I express my gratitude to each participant for their valuable contribution and constructive feedback during this evaluation process, which has significantly shaped and enhanced the strength of this evaluation. Your engagement has been instrumental in ensuring that the quality and the depth of this assessment, Thank you all for your active involvement. And finally, I am eagerly anticipating the insight for this evaluation as we continue to collaborate with Tango and learn and grow and help the livelihoods of Nigerians. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Jasmine. Karen, it would be great if you could take over.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great, and thank you. Apparently I was muted, apologies. Thank you, Jasmine, very much for your comments. I'm Karen Fox, a senior research advisor at Tango International and a lead researcher for this Northeast Nigeria resilience study carried out under the REAL Award, as Jasmine mentioned. It's really helpful to hear insights directly from the mission in terms of how this work fits into those broader objectives of the mission strategy and provides information that can help implementers, USAID funded implementers in the Northeast have the information they need to make decisions over the life of activities. So as you know, this is our third recurrent monitoring survey in the Northeast and our fourth chance to come together to reflect on the study findings over the past year, going back to our initial qualitative assessment that we carried out in April of 2022. We just, as Jasmine said, thank you all for your inputs and your participation in the study and in these conversations. And today, as previously, we really do appreciate the opportunity to share these findings with you and then to discuss with you the implications for resilience programming in the Northeast and elsewhere. I'd also just like to note we have members of our qualitative and quantitative data collection and analysis teams here from Tango and our Nigerian research partner, Binomial Optimist Limited. I'd also really like to acknowledge the ongoing contributions and support of the rural resilience activity from start to finish, backstopping data collection and helping us to ground truth the preliminary findings as they emerge. Thank you all. Next slide, please. So I'll just provide a brief overview of our time today, as well as situate our RMS study in the broader context of the overall Northeast Nigeria resilience study. So for the remainder of our hour and a half together, we'll just take a moment to quickly review the analytical methods and share some of the top line findings right up front from this third round of the RMS to give you some key takeaways. And then we'll break these down and present the findings by thematic area. As Anna mentioned, we'll pause a couple of times during that presentation of the more detailed findings for some short Q&As just to break things up and give us all a chance to digest the information. And then we'd like to pose to you a few core conclusions and some questions related to resilience and market systems programming with some time for discussion before a quick overview of the next steps following this RMS. Next slide, please. So since this is, as I mentioned, our third RMS conversation, we won't go into detail on the overall study design, but just offer this slide to refresh on how the RMS fits into this broader Northeast Nigeria study and in relation to the broader context and shock environment in the Northeast. So as you'll recall, the overall objective of the study is to understand if and how a portfolio of resilience interventions can mitigate the negative impacts of shocks and stresses, ideally avert humanitarian need, and as Jasmine mentioned, ultimately improve well-being, particularly during conflict and compounding shock crises in the Beji states of the Northeast, Borno, Adamawa, Yobe, and Gombe. We have two primary research questions. The first to investigate the effectiveness of market systems development approaches, layered with peace building and humanitarian assistance. And then the second is to explore the dynamics of displacement in relation to resilience programming. How are resilience capacities affected by conflict and displacement? And as many of you know, John Meyer, as he mentioned once, so articulately, do resilience capacities travel? So that's, again, these are the core questions we're looking into. So you'll see the study components depicted in yellow on this slide with the initial qualitative inquiry, followed by 4 rounds of a recurrent monitoring survey. And then lastly, the follow-on in-depth study that will draw on the findings of the RMS as well as the initial inquiry and give us a chance to dig more deeply into both the market system development questions and the displacement dynamics. So this RMS, as you know, collects 4 rounds of data at 3 to 6 month intervals. You'll see in the yellow row, this third round of data was collected in May, with RMS 4 planned for late August, September to mirror data collection for RMS 1. We do have a longer recall period for this interim round, which extends from the end of the last harvest into the planting season. Now, this longer period was intentional to accommodate anticipated disruptions due to elections as well as Eid holidays. So one issue we'll discuss throughout the presentation is the red line showing inflation and the suite of macroeconomic shocks that have, as you know, significantly impacted people over the last 6 months. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague and the quantitative study lead for the Recurrent Monitoring Survey, Gita Temsa, a senior research scientist with Tango International. Thanks all.
Gita, apologies for interrupting, but you're on mute still.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm double muted, typical. So thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning. With this next round of slides, as Karen mentioned, we're going to briefly review the methodology, give you some top line findings, and then jump into some of the more details and nuances of the findings. So as we've all grown accustomed in the last couple of rounds of the RMS, we typically perform round by round statistical comparisons of key indicators to see whether there has been any change over time. We've specifically focused on measures of food security, key drivers of resilience that we identified from analyses conducted in round one, and also measures of the use and adoption of the targeted market services and production practices that RA is supporting through its market systems development approach. Throughout this presentation, you'll hear me talking about change over time, and that's or no change. And typically when we say change, we're referring to differences between rounds that are statistically significant at the 0.05 level or lower. In addition to the analyses of the survey data, our team analyzed qualitative data from focus group discussions and key informant interviews. We integrated the qualitative information to triangulate and contextualize survey results. And when interpreting findings, we put into context or reflected on the differences in recall periods between rounds, which Karen touched upon. We also thought about differences in seasonality effects and the contextual factors, of course. To interpret the contextual factors, we turn to secondary sources such as FuseNet. We also turn to our own, the data we collected via the qualitative interviews, specifically information around the poor macroeconomic conditions, as well as conflict, political instability, and displacement. Some of the key top-line findings include the fact, and not surprisingly, that households continue to grapple with increased food prices, fuel costs, and the impact of cash shortages that resulted from the currency change that was introduced by the government. And we really saw this impact of the poor macroeconomic conditions and ongoing insecurity reflected in the levels of household food insecurity that persisted across all three rounds. Most households, that's over 3/4, continue to be moderately or severely food insecure. And we also learned in round three that the number of households who are worried about having sufficient food to feed themselves is growing. The severity of the situation is underscored by this dramatic shift in household coping strategies that we are seeing in round three, which are more extreme or negative compared to prior rounds. For example, we see more households selling off productive assets, sending children to work, and migrating their household members, as well as marrying off their daughters to cope with the impact of shocks and stresses. The poor 2022 harvest, combined with the ongoing high cost of inputs and the impacts of the currency redesign, have had far-reaching impacts on households' livelihood strategies. And this is showing up in a couple of different ways. We're seeing fewer households engaged in own farming or agricultural wage labor because of the difficulty of acquiring and affording inputs, the difficulty of obtaining credit, and also hiring workers. we're also seeing more households shift to non-agricultural labor or petty trade as a means of securing food and income. And we're also learning from our qualitative data, we're seeing some farming households shift into or expand into processing and livestock, also as a strategy to cope with these unprecedented shocks and their compounding effects. The worsening macroeconomic conditions and the limited familiarity with cashless transactions have made it challenging to improve access to financial services, which we know is one of the core areas of the of RRA. And because this is critical for securing access to productivity enhancing inputs and other investments in livelihood activities. But we are on the flip side also seeing in the qualitative data that businesses and farmer households very much understand and appreciate the importance of being plugged into or tied into the formal financial services. And we're also seeing from the qualitative data that an increase in the use of formal banking services, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the coming slides. Similarly, we're seeing VSLAs had largely discontinued their loan services at the height of the cash shortage. But we also note that some continue to provide social support among their members, and that even some of them have resumed their financial service functions. The data on the use of targeted market services and improved production practices indicate no improvement from prior round. And that really just underscores to us the difficulty of strengthening market access and functions amidst these unprecedented macroeconomic pressures that were also compounded by harvest shortfalls. But one of the key top line findings as well is that despite this economic hardship, we know and can see that households continue to support each other. And to the extent possible, for example, by sharing food, and also with little external humanitarian assistance. And with that, we can transition into a more detailed set of findings, starting with food security. As I just mentioned, we don't see any change in food insecurity levels. They've been high since round one and continue to be high at greater than 75%. And that is represented by the topmost portions of the columns. Our findings are consistent with FuseNet's Outlook report and Outlook update, which indicated that food availability was unusually low in February of 2023, and that food stocks were mostly depleted in April of this year and as early as March among households in the more inaccessible areas of the Northeast. In fact, many households in the Northeast experienced crisis food insecurity. And it's expected or projected that we're going to see, well, FuseNet expects an early onset of the lean season and crisis food outcomes in conflict-stricken areas. And that's something we're going to be paying attention to in round 4. The qualitative data underscore how difficult it's been for households to cope with to afford food in the context of this widespread economic hardship. Farm productivity has declined because of a number of factors such as the drought, flooding, strong winds, and cost of inputs. And households have had, even though some of the households are engaged in dry season farming, the yield has been low. They've depleted some of their food stocks and having really to turn to market-based sourcing their food from the markets, purchasing that. And we'll get into kind of the different coping strategies households have taken on in this context. The average number of shocks or stresses reported by households declined round by round. This is, of course, not surprising because, as we all know, the RMS gathers information on a range of biological, climate, and economic shocks, and we know many of these are seasonal and they fluctuate. But the big takeaway here is most households continue to grapple with the increased food prices and fuel costs. We see that the percentage of households reporting higher food prices increased since round 2, and the percent that are reporting fuel shortages almost doubled since the last round. And this is also corroborated by FuseNet's reporting that this is, in fact, that record high inflation since 2005 that's largely been driven by food price increases. And that high prices for most of the staple foods persisted, especially in April. In terms of conflict, theft, and violence, the survey data show a decline in the percentage of households reporting theft or destruction of assets across all rounds. There's been no change in livestock theft or conflict over natural resources or community violence between rounds 2 and 3. The qualitative data indicate election violence and unrest occurred in some of the communities, but overall, the situation was manageable. Many businesses did shut down during this period in anticipation of violence. And again, here our findings triangulate with FuseNet that pointed to relative stability in terms of the frequency and intensity of conflict in the Northeast since 2022. There are attacks, but most of the attacks in the Northeast are concentrated in Borno and largely localized attacks in LGAs that are mainly outside of the study areas. In terms of disease, our survey indicates that there was no change in the percentage of households that experienced human disease, but what we do see is a decline in households reporting illness or hospitalization related expenses. And we learned from the qualitative interviews, and that's because the current economic hardship households are facing, primarily the cash crunch, the cost of fuel and transportation, is making it really hard for households to afford medical care, including the ability to pay for the care, the ability to afford transportation services is also a challenge. The cashless policy was the #1 shock in round 3 that dominated discussion across qualitative interviews in all states. Restrictions on the use of old currency and inadequate supply of new notes caused the cash crunch. And the situation is really best summarized by this quote to the right here. We don't know the reason for this policy. The Nigerian government is not developed to the stage of implementing the e-Naira. The financial institutions are also not up to date. Cash disappeared, farmers had no access to money, and the POS merchants were exploiting people. It also affected me. No one was left out. We couldn't afford to come to the office, not to mention visiting farmers. We could not pay our daily paid staff. Our activities were at a standstill. It affected us socially, morally, and even spiritually. This is a quote from a male key informant interview with an agricultural service provider. Our analysis of the qualitative data point to a number of challenges that the shift in the currency created, mainly as a result of the lack of infrastructure and technology, which impacted both the demand and supply side of market services. This includes some of the challenges include periodic transfer failures due to network outages or congestion, limited availability of point of service providers, they're far and few, also coupled with the difficulty obtaining cash from banks, having to wait in long lines overnight, with also limits on withdrawals. Also, some of the merchants were charging higher fees for POS transactions, and this has impacted businesses. It's resulted with smaller and fewer transactions, and in some cases, the closure of small businesses and a loss of livelihoods. In terms of coping strategies, we are seeing a dramatic shift, as I previously alluded, in the way households are dealing with the impact of shocks and stresses. If you recall, in prior rounds, the most common strategies for coping with shocks included a combination of reducing food consumption and modifying diets, as well as borrowing from friends and family. So just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this change, in round 3, about 1% of households reduced their food consumption or consumed less nutritious or fewer foods, compared to 50% or more in prior rounds. In round 3, on the other hand, the most common coping strategy was reducing non-essential spending and getting food on credit. So we saw about 60% reduced non-essential spending in round 3 compared to about 25% in round 1 and 2. And then we saw about 50% of households getting food on credit in round 3 compared to 10% in less round 1 and round 2. But the bigger point here is not just that households are reducing non-essential spendings, but that they are doing that in combination with relying on negative or extreme coping strategies. And we've seen an increase in that shift towards negative or extreme coping strategies. And we can give you a few examples here. So, for example, about 30% of households sold productive assets in round 3, compared to about 3% or less in round 1 and 2. Similarly, about more than 30% sent their children to work for money, compared to 2% or less in rounds 1 and 2. We also, in round 3, saw about 13% of households marrying off their daughters. This was reported as a coping strategy, and this was not reported by any households in prior rounds. And we're also seeing about a 10-fold increase in households migrating some or all of their members to cope with the impact of a shock. And so what that looks like is about 10% in round 3 compared to less than 1% in prior rounds. And again, our findings are consistent with the FuseNet Outlook and Outlook update, which underscore reliance on extreme coping strategies that would be consistent with crisis and emergency levels, particularly among households in inaccessible areas of the Northeast. Our qualitative data also underscore that many households are indeed selling off their assets, their goods and their harvest even at a loss, just because they need and want to get their hands on some cash. We know that shopkeepers and merchants operating food stalls are cutting their prices just to make any sale. And again, this is also corroborated by FuseNet, which indicates localized accounts of traders selling at discounted prices for buyers, who are willing to purchase in cash. We're seeing several different ways that households are coping in terms of diversifying their livelihoods. Some are adopting new income generating activities, others are transitioning to new ones or modifying existing activities. We'll unpack that a little bit more when we get to the section on livelihoods. We're also seeing some households bartering as a response to the cash scarcity. So, and what that looks like is exchanging food items. And we also see another approach is for shopkeepers to set up informal accounts with shopkeepers who are accepting old currency and also tracking household savings and providing goods in exchange. Moving over to livelihoods. Livelihood diversification is a key component of adaptive capacity. This is one of the key findings from round 1. We note that in general, households combine on average about 4 different livelihood activities as a way to feed themselves or acquire income. And this really hasn't changed between round 2 and round 3. But what we're seeing is again, a shift away from own farming and crop production, as well as agricultural labor, that declined from round 2. So for example, the percent of households engaged in crop production declined from about 2/3 to under 1/2 in round 3. We also saw participation in agricultural wage labor. Actually, that declined round by round from about 50 to 40, then 25%. And just to keep in mind that our recall period for round 3 overlaps with the tail end of the harvest period, the land preparation and planting season. And so when we might have expected that to increase or at least remain steady. But we see similar findings from FuseNet, which points to the fact that agricultural activities during this period were below average. In other words, what would be expected for this time of the year. And although tri-season farming is ongoing, it's below normal levels. And middle and wealthier households cannot afford, to hire agricultural wage labor. As I mentioned earlier, one of the coping strategies has been to adopt a dynamic mix of strategies when it comes to livelihoods. This includes diversifying within the same livelihood or activity, adding and or shifting to a new business. So for example, just to give just concrete examples here, women that would typically be producing groundnut oil are now making groundnut cake, or farmer households that are engaged in the production of a certain commodity are now also engaged in food processing and sales. We're also seeing from the quantitative data an increase in the participation in non-agricultural wage labor and petty trade. The qualitative data illustrate numerous examples of youth migrating to the towns to take on menial work in order to send remittances home. We're also seeing from the qualitative data more men investing in their wives' businesses, for example, their food processing businesses or direct sales, because they understand that in doing so, they are contributing to improving their household's income. Moving on to social capital, collective action, and humanitarian assistance. One of the key takeaways from round 3 is, despite the economic hardship, social capital in Northeast Nigeria and the RA areas remains steady. And that while it may be difficult for households to support each other, what we're learning from the qualitative data is that they continue to do so with whatever means they have. We know that there's been no decline in access to social capital. That is a measure of the degree to which households perceive they can rely on their networks of friends and family for support. The average scores on these indices remained moderate, about 3 out of 6. But when it comes to the utilization of bonding and bridging social capital, we actually saw an increase from our round 2. And what that means is that there were more households giving and receiving assistance in round 3 compared to round 2. The average score on the index of collective action, which is a count of the different types of activities that households or communities engage in to improve their conditions, didn't change in round 3 compared to round 2, but it overall declined compared to round 1. And perhaps some of this can be understood in terms of seasonality effects. So for example, participation in soil conservation and flood diversion declined, but these are also seasonal activities. Qualitative interviews indicate that the fuel price hikes have made it difficult to get to community events because it's less accessible or affordable. But at the same time, despite this diminishing capacity to share, communities continue to work together to quote unquote make life bearable. The qualitative interviews also underscore just how important these social connections are between community members in times of distress, and particularly with this cash scarcity. That members do continue to support each other, for example, by sharing food, participating in community events, taking on collective work activities. Even IDPs report receiving support from host communities despite the how difficult the current circumstances are. But there are multiple examples of people being no longer able to share food or ask for food because they know that their quote unquote neighbor is struggling with food as well. And to put this all again in context of the backdrop here, that these social exchanges are happening under these very dire economic conditions, but also with very little to no humanitarian assistance. In fact, receipt of formal support from the government or NGOs declined across rounds from about 9% to 3%, and then under 1%. There's been very few mentions of humanitarian assistance in the qualitative data. And at this point, we can pause for a Q&A. If there are any questions related to food security, shocks, coping strategies, and social capital.
Oh, thank you, Gita. A lot of information to take in. We do have a question in the Q&A box from Danielle Jolie Couleur with Mercy Corps regarding the finding that men are increasingly investing in their wives' businesses, and the extent to which this is a new finding that's popping up in the data set. So I don't know, maybe if Charles, you'd like to respond to that? It's Charles Meisch on our qualitative analysis team. Yeah, and perhaps Charles is muted. I'll just jump in that this is something new that we're seeing in the data set. And it's interesting, some of the quotes that came out of the qualitative data indicated that in the past, there was some skepticism about men investing in women's businesses, about recognition that women handle money well, but to some extent out of necessity, and the fact that men have capital, they're increasingly using that capital to invest in women's businesses, primarily things like food processing and direct sales, to increase overall access to cash for a household. So yeah, John Meyer, I see you've got a question. We'll just take one more question and then turn it back over to Gita. John, if you'd like to unmute.
I think I'm unmuted. Hi, Karen.
Hi.
Hey.
We can.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great info. I'm thinking back to the point about VSLAs. And so 2 or 3 very quick questions. So the information was interesting that they stopped giving loans, but then started up again maybe later when things got a little bit better. So question number 1, does RRA help setting up VSLAs? Is that a program output for us? Number 2, were there any other actions that the VSLAs took as a group that might be a sign of resilience? Like in Ethiopia, they internally decided to share out funds and then internally chose the moment to reform and how to reform, et cetera. And so that a lot of reassuring info from there. How did it work in Northeast Nigeria? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question, John. I'll just briefly respond and then pass it back over to Gita. I'm glad you picked up on that point. It's certainly something that caught our attention. And what's interesting is in corroborating the qualitative and quantitative data, in the qualitative data, we saw a lot of discussion around the closure and the cessation of these VSLAs, which, to your question, is a program strategy for RRA. And I see John Rakchar has got his hand up, so I don't want to speak on behalf of you, John. But yes, very much a strategy and something that RRA has been promoting from the beginning of the activity. So again, the qualitative data showed that the VSLAs were shutting down, but the quantitative data showed little change in VSLA activities. So what we also read into the qualitative data is that those VSLAs, they shut down when there was no sort of formal financial function. And as things have begun to stabilize a bit, have reopened and are resuming that activity. But in the meantime, there was this kind of cluster of VSLAs across the sample that continued to meet for mutual social support and provide information to its members. So there was this sort of ongoing function of the VSLAs, even if it wasn't that primary financial function. Again, I don't want to take too much time. I don't know if that answers your question, and certainly something we can dig into a little bit more when we get into the final discussion. So back over to you, Geeta. Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to mention one other thing with the VSLAs. Another thing that was interesting, I think Geeta's going to touch on this in the next discussion on financial services, was because those VSLAs had also been supporting financial literacy and providing information about how to open bank accounts. That was another core function of the VSLAs during this cash crisis. So sorry, over to you, Geeta, and don't mean to steal the thunder on financial services. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Not at all. I appreciate the transition into, it's going to be actually our next set of findings. Just want to make sure that we have the go ahead to proceed. Are there any other comments or questions at this point?
I thought John had one.
John, over to you.
No, thank you. I think I wanted to only respond to the question that John had asked. And already Karen gave a good response. I thank you. I lowered my hand because it was really answered. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, John. This next set of findings are around the market services and production practices RA is promoting via its network of market actors and partners. And again, here, just to start off and remind us that the key kind of takeaway is we've seen little change over time. So there's been some decline, but for the most part, many of the indicators have held steady, and which poses a number of interesting questions, which I know Karen is going to get into on the program implications side, but really just underscoring the complexity of promoting these services and practices in this very complex context. In terms of access to financial services, which is one of the key pillars or set of services that RA is promoting, to summarize, there's been no change in households that are borrowing cash, formally or informally, or households that are saving cash, and this is across all rounds. We can't speak to with the quantitative data as to how much, the nuances, if you will, of how much households are borrowing or saving. But we do understand from the qualitative data, we get a better sense of just how difficult it has been to access loans. And so we'll get into that shortly. In terms of agricultural insurance, we can say that that's remained very low across all 3 rounds. That's less than 1%. The qualitative data do indicate a general lack of awareness of and familiarity with insurance products and services. And that's been kind of a recurrent theme as well. We know from the qualitative data that households do understand the importance of being connected to formal banking services. Many have rushed to open bank accounts with the onset of the cashless policy and have become more familiar with online transfers. But we, at the same time, note from the qualitative data that many people and businesses continue to be unbanked and are not able to or willing to accept or engage in cash transfers. The qualitative interviews point to several challenges with formal banking, some of which I touched upon earlier. Poor networks make transfers unreliable. the limited access to cash, long queues, daily withdrawal limits, high point of service fees are also an issue. Financial literacy or lack thereof is a challenge as well. Individuals that are illiterate struggle with bank accounts and transfers. And then again, this creates constraints in terms of, these factors create constraints in terms of who is able to participate in these market transactions, and also, begs the question of who falls out. Many farmers continue to struggle with acquiring loans. Some of these themes that have come up across multiple rounds of the qualitative data include the difficulty of just having the paperwork that's needed, like the national identity number, being able to find a guarantor, being able to afford the down payments, and also the poor credit history because of the difficulty of paying off outstanding loans, which we know has been tied into some of these recurrent shocks that have impacted farmer households and businesses' ability to make substantial sales and income. But we also do see some evidence in the qualitative data that VSLAs and financial service providers are helping people open bank accounts. And so that's one of the positive findings. As Karen mentioned earlier, the survey data indicate no change in household membership in community savings and loans groups. It's a little over 10%. It's been at that level since round one. We've also seen no change in the percentage of households that participate in credit or microfinance groups. That's about 1% or less. And these are, again, vehicles that RA is supporting. The qualitative interviews provide a little more nuanced picture, indicating that at some point, some VSLAs did shut down, particularly around the cash scarcity period. That's January to March of this year, but some have slowly reopened. And then others stayed open as a platform for providing support to each other, even though they were unable to provide loans at the time. We also know that community shops, have acted as informal lenders during this time. We touched upon this earlier, that they continue to accept all notes and to create private accounts that individuals could purchase from. In terms of training, the survey captured or collected information on any training that the household received, regardless of the provider or donor. Some examples of some of the more market systems related training are illustrated in the box to the right. We want to underscore again, because of the market systems development approach that RAs taken, which tends to be more facilitative, that there's very little direct training by RA. And so with that understanding, our survey data show that training participation was low in round one. That's about 40% or less, and declined to even lower levels in round two. So that's about less than 2%. We didn't really see an improvement in round three. We were expecting to see an improvement because the qualitative interviews in round two suggested that the timing of the training tends to more likely to coincide with the farming period just before or during. But we also learned from the round three qualitative interviews that participation in training was limited because of some of the macroeconomic conditions we pointed to earlier, namely the cost of transportation, making it difficult to get to these opportunities. But we do know from also the qualitative interviews that businesses and the trainings that were provided by businesses or organizations were very helpful to farmer households. It helped them expand their customer base, introduce them to best practices, as well as cost-saving techniques. In addition to inquiring about participation in training, the RMS also collects information on, or collects data on information exposure. And so this can give us kind of a broader handle on access to information that doesn't necessarily come from direct training. And examples of, again, production or market related information are illustrated in the box to the right. And what we've seen is that the average score on the index, information exposure index, which is a count, goes from 0 to 20, that has declined round by round. It's gone from an average of 9 to 7 to approximately 6. Some of the possible explanation here, again, we cannot rule out seasonality effects, difference in recall period, but again, also the cost of fuel, which constrains access to training and the ability to travel to markets. We know that people tend to get information in the market. And another explanation is also just the shift in livelihood strategies away from planting to petty trade and non-agricultural wage labor could maybe potentially explain some of this decline in access to information, production information. In round 3, we saw a decline in participation in value chain production. So that is the percentage of households that are engaged in raising a livestock or growing a crop with the intention of selling some or most of it. That has declined steadily round by round, from about 55% in round 1 to 42, then down to 33%. We note that most households did not cultivate crops in round 3. So that's about 80% did not cultivate crops. Again, this is an overlap with the tail end of the harvest period, the planting and line preparation. And so we're keeping an eye on this and monitoring this, and we'll be paying attention to it in round 4, because we'd really like to get a handle again on who are these households. Well, number one, are these households that fell out of value chain production and farming, will they go back in round 4? And for those that fall out, who are they? And then what are the characteristics of those households that are able to stay in value chain production? What are the characteristics that distinguish them and enable them to take advantage of some of the market services and that are available? In terms of livestock production, we did not see a change in the percent of households raising targeted commodity livestock. The qualitative interviews, again, point to how much businesses and farmers have been struggling with price fluctuations, cash scarcity, high cost of inputs and fuel that have made it very difficult to continue to function. And this is reflected in business closures that occurred because of low patronage. Again, here we're seeing, to keep in mind how different players are being impacted, both on the demand side and the supply side. This is very much underscored with in the qualitative data. In terms of access to input market services, use of agricultural extension services and precision farming advisory services were low in round 1. That's illustrated in the first column in the table to the right. They declined to even lower levels in round 2. And we see no improvement in round 3. The qualitative data point to recurrent themes from round 2 that can help explain why we're not seeing improvements in agricultural extension service use or farming advisory services that are tied to the difficulty of reaching these services because of the cost of transportation, and also just the diminished capacities of farmer households to be able to take advantage of these services, the fact that many of them are dropping out of value chain production, and also the lack of agricultural extension staff. Agriculture and livestock input suppliers in all states frequently mentioned inflation as limiting their capacity to acquire products and supply services. The cash scarcity has reduced market activity, leading to fewer and smaller transactions or purchases. border closures have also constrained cross-border commerce for those that have clients in Cameroon and other states. Banditry and insecurity have also continued to disrupt input supply chains and constrain suppliers. And also, as we noted earlier, some of these, the shift to the e-Naira and the faulty transfers due to network and system failures have also made it more difficult for providers to function. And some of the scams have also created a sense of mistrust so in conducting these transactions. So for example, sometimes customers have insufficient funds to complete the transaction. In terms of output market services, we generally note there was no change, and examples of the output market services that RA is supporting are illustrated in the table here to the left. For us, the question and the outstanding question is, if this is a seasonality effect, we'd like to maybe first off understand when would be the typical stage in which farmer households would link up with output market providers, so that we can better track this and maybe also interpret these findings. And also, we'd like to get a better handle of, getting a better understanding of what is impacting the ability of these output markets service providers to function. And that could be an area to focus on in the next round. There's been no change in participation in crop or livestock producer and marketing groups. We did see a decline in farmers cooperatives, round 3 versus round 1. And again, some of this could be related to seasonal activities of farming cooperatives. But we also know from the qualitative data that some of these cooperatives have been struggling with price volatility, cash scarcity, and the inability to secure loans. In terms of the improved agricultural practices that RA is promoting, generally no change in the uptake of the crop production practices. Fertilizer application and use of improved seeds declined in round 2, but didn't change in round 3. We note that most farmers continue to use some form of improved storage. RA's provision of a cocoon has prevented harvest loss and improved storage quantity. But we do note that that just how much households can store has been diminished because the floods destroyed, as you all know, and we all know, destroyed crops in the previous farming season. So many farmers really didn't have a large surplus of grains to store. And also many have sold off their stored grain at cheaper prices in order to meet their immediate cash needs. There's been no change in the use of improved livestock practices across all rounds, with just a few exceptions. The qualitative reports suggested some of the limited uptake of the improved practices are again tied to the high cost of inputs, the inability to pay for livestock services, and in some cases diminished stocks due to disease or theft. And with that, we can have another pause for another Q&A.
So I don't see any hands up. Did I miss that? But we do have some interesting questions and observations in the chat box, specifically around the extent to which financial literacy might have, or financial training, market skill sets might have helped people weather the storm, particularly when training participation was so low. So I'm going to pause there. I see Ayode's hand raised. Would you like to go ahead and unmute?
Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to check from the feedback you gave around the market. You noted that the effect of scarcity led to decrease in sales, but I think I'm not sure if we are just trying to prioritize that, because I think the major concern around cash scarcity was that farmers and the market actors were still able to sell, only that they were forced to sell at poor prices, just in exchange of cash. So I wouldn't know which side that summary or finding is coming from, or perhaps it's just one of the key things you'd like to highlight from the findings. So I just wanted to check if that was the only thing you capture, or there were other ones based on the one I mentioned, or you just decided to highlight that. Thank you. Over.
So Gita or Mark, would you like to respond to the question?
Thanks, Karen. On the quantitative side, we can't really speak to that. As you know, some of the effects of the cash scarcity on the size or of transactions that are happening. I think this is one of the findings that came out from the qualitative interviews in terms of one of the impacts that this shift to a cashless economy, reduction of new Naira notes has created. But with that, I'd like to turn it over either to Mark and also Charles and other members of the qualitative team who have spent far more time than I in the details of the qualitative data. Over.
Hi,
Thanks.
yeah, this is Mark from Tango. Yeah, I think this is an example of sort of a general trend that we've been really seeing in this third round, and that is that the financial well, a combination of the monetary crises and you know, inflation, for rising inflation for various reasons. One of the impacts of that has been really on the demand side of markets. And so I think that's, you know, one of the things that we're trying to explore now is what is the, you know, if the sudden shock that's really affecting the demand side, the demand for agricultural inputs, in particular, agricultural inputs and services, what is the best way to, number one, perhaps, you know, how can the supply side of the market adjust to that problem? But also, are there other kinds of interventions that could help to sort of help to increase the effective demand side for those goods and services? Over.
Thank you for that, Mark. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, Charles.
Yes, we hear
Great.
you.
Okay, yeah, just had to reset my microphone real quick. It was working this morning. Now it's working again. Great. Yeah, so that question about the farmers and market agents, certainly it's impacted them by selling for cheaper than desired prices. But looking at other like market actors, it's like these small households in our interviews, those trying to sell food at markets, like food sellers or food processors, they really struggled because oftentimes they didn't have bank accounts, and so they weren't able to make any sales. So some of them really struggled during the cash scarcity period. We have other examples of like local shopkeepers in the markets, just generally noticing decreased sales due to people's capacity to make large purchases have diminished. So they're noticing that people oftentimes are making fewer and smaller purchases due to the constrained cash flow. I hope that helps shed some light. Over.
Thanks, Mark and Charles, for the response. It's a really important and critical question. And I think, you know, Mark summed it up with Charles providing some examples that we really saw the effects on both the supply and the demand side of this situation. So I see John Rakchara, you've got your hand up. If we can hear from you, and then
Yes.
we'll turn
Just
it back
to-
over to, we'll resume the slides. Go ahead, John.
Just to add a piece from the field to the question, they asked very good question. From experience from the resilience activity, we saw that both happened. Those who were selling really for significantly less the value of the commodities, but the majority of the farmers were unable to sell because traditionally and typically grain markets are cash-based markets. And I just thought I should add that piece, to the question that you did ask. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, John. And yes, what you shared is very much aligned with what we saw in the qualitative data in particular about various seed fairs or market events where suppliers may have been able to come and participate, although they also obviously faced constraints. But the buyers weren't able to either participate because of transport or just lack of cash to purchase inputs, et cetera. So, and thanks for those questions. If we can go ahead to the next slide in the time that remains, we wanted to carry on this discussion with you just by summarizing a few of the key points from what Geeta has presented, and then pose some questions to you. And I think your questions and comments have preempted that, where as you're hearing and reading the findings from this, it's prompting questions and discussion that we've had as we've gone through the data analysis. So next slide, please. Ultimately, the main takeaway here, as Geeta said, the number one shock was the cashless policy and the monetary financial stress. It absolutely eclipsed all other shocks. While we had expected displacement and conflict and weather-related shocks, as you know from round 2, our primary shock was flooding. But in this round, it was really that macroeconomic situation that was compounded by the climatic shocks of flood in the previous round and a poor harvest. So it really forced households to struggle with food insecurity, and as Geeta emphasized, really rely more on negative and extreme coping strategies. I think some of the conversation in the chat has already hit on our question about this very unprecedented and unanticipated external shock that very much got to the core of a market systems program approach and affected both the supply and in particular the demand side. How does that then lead us to rethink intervention strategies? What types of strategies and to what extent? I think Danielle had pointed out in the chat, in particular around training, lack of participation. As Geeta mentioned, people had difficulty accessing training with fuel and transport constraints. So that's, again, one of our core questions. I'll go through just a few slides with some of these key takeaways and questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Next slide, please. So, as Geeta had mentioned, one of the things that we saw was, despite all this hardship, social capital and inter-household giving continued to be stable. So people are continuing to support each other. But as we've seen increase in negative coping strategies, and in particular, a real worry that was expressed about where people will get food, the social capital component and the collective action piece is very much something to keep an eye on. We did see, again, the offering of market network fairs and events, seed fairs. VSLAs continued to function as possible, even if it wasn't for internal loans. But all of this also, as Geeta described, very much constrained people's ability to participate in collective activities. So our question really is, and also, she mentioned the importance of barter and sort of shopkeeper and input supplier loans to help people manage during the cash crunch. So the question is, in thinking about program interventions, how can we consider the non-monetary support mechanisms, including the social capital piece and the barter and exchange mechanisms? And how can projects work to better support collective activities that will be able to provide ongoing access to critical market goods and services at a time when people aren't able to access those through cash purchases. And similarly, how to support this very dynamic situation of shifting in and out of various livelihood strategies. So again, next slide. And this really gets to, I think, the comment that Gita made earlier about who's able to take advantage of market systems interventions at a time of great financial stress, and who's left out. And we saw a real difference, in particular in the qualitative data. Again, shopkeepers, business owners, service providers, input providers were clearly affected by the policy. But the key informant interviews indicated that they had, some capital, in general, capital and the skill set to navigate the storm, access to cash, access to networks. Whereas our focus group discussions painted quite a different picture of a real lack of ability to participate, lack of awareness of trainings or services that could have been provided, and in part that was a supply side issue. Extension agents and suppliers weren't able to get to farmers. But again, we saw that households were very much struggling and not able to take advantage of some of the market services that they had clearly articulated taking advantage of in our previous rounds of RMS, and as well as the initial assessment. As Gita mentioned, there's very low levels of humanitarian assistance. Those declined. So there was no real evidence of humanitarian assistance, and very, very few mentions of any support in the qualitative data during this time of cash crunch, which again led to that kind of decreased kind of demand for services. So here again, we just offer these questions about how to think of more effectively about engaging at-risk households in market systems interventions, particularly during a time of these external shocks outside of the control of any program that very much affect the ability of people to participate. And what role does humanitarian assistance play in that? So with that, I'd like to just open it up for discussion and Q&A. I think we have some questions in the chat box, as well as in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
You see Mark or Tim?
Yeah, I would just like to respond to John's comment about social capital. No, I think social capital still is very much a resilience capacity here, but the thing that we often forget is that social capital is a finite resource. And you can use it, but until you use it up. And if you have continual shocks and stressors that are plaguing people, and everybody is starting to run out of resources to share, it becomes more and more difficult to help each other out. So I think we're kind of reaching a precipice in terms of, it's working up to now, but it could get really bad if something's not done soon. And what makes me think that we're kind of reaching that tipping point is the fact that we're selling off productive assets to meet some of those food needs. And I think that is definitely a threshold you don't want to be passing through. And then I think Nate had a question about collective action. I think we were thinking of collective action is more like engaging in joint activities that kind of benefit the community. That could be putting in flood walls to protect fields, or it could be putting in health dispensaries, or something that the community participates in that has a collective benefit for the community. And those, when it becomes more and more difficult for people to have resources or time to engage in that kind of stuff, those collective activities start to go down. Over.
Thank you, Tim. I see Mark's hand up, and Mark, I'd like to turn the microphone over to you, but also just to follow on that question of Nate's around collective activities. And how we conceive of collective action around the flood mitigation work, community events and mutual support, but how we are thinking about that also in terms of a market systems development activity. So Mark, and then Jasmine and Ioti.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think just to follow up on Tim's point, I think, my sort of interpretation of one of the things that happened during this, over the course of this third round, was that there was a sudden, because of the attempted move to a cashless economy, the ENIRA, there was a very sudden decline in the level of trust in financial transactions, and sort of as a reflection of, or a result of that, I guess, that people had to sort of turn to more towards social capital. And so I think one of the sort of programmatic questions then is, what can be done to try and sort of reestablish more trust in market transactions. And I think this is an area where perhaps sort of collective action strategies in terms of supporting collective marketing activities could be an avenue for consideration, where if you organize marketing activities that are undertaken by small groups of producers or buyers that sort of have trust amongst themselves, perhaps that's a way to start to reestablish trust in engaging it in market transactions. Over.
Thanks, Mark. And trust was clearly it was a characteristic that came out in the qualitative data in terms of who suppliers were doing business with, particularly when there wasn't cash in circulation. It was about trust and social networks. So Ioti, over to you. Sorry, and then Jasmine.
Okay, thank you so much. Just to comment on what Max said before I move to my question or my comment also. The issue of trust actually came about as a result of imbalances that people experience within the network from the service provider, particularly financial institutions, because usually many people don't make use of online transaction. At least there's a limited number of people who engage that system. Or as a result of lack of cash, several people move on to the platform, and in the process of that, a number of things went wrong, which led to a kind of a jam in the system. So I think that also actually led to the issue of distrust in the system. Coming back to my question, I just wanted to say that, my comment, it is important that we are mindful when making recommendations around the impact of this cash scarcity on the market system. We need to be mindful of the fact that the impact varies across board. What we experience, for instance, in a region like Northeast is completely different from other places. Why farmers were forced to sell their product at low prices, in some other places, the price of commodity went so high. And it was just because people that were selling at that point in time were actually taking advantage of the opportunity. So why it led to increase in commodity prices in some locations, places like Northeast, where we have majority of farmers domicile in the same place, particularly, let's say, agricultural producing areas. People were forced to lower their commodity prices. So that is one thing we need to understand. Then the other part of it is, there was a question you asked in the presentation that, do we really need to redesign the market system approach as a result of the impact of that cash scarcity? I will say that we also need to consider two things. One, the extent to which the impact of the cash scarcity affected the market system? That is one. The other thing is, do we have the same effect in the short term and also in the long run? Because the system is not going to be the same. So these are the two things. But from what happened the last time, what we saw actually in the recent was that in the agricultural producing areas, a lot of people are affected, and it's just because of market glut that came as a result of that. So all of these are very important factor to be considered when making recommendations. We need to be mindful of the system, we need to be mindful of scale, we need to be mindful of locations and the variety of impacts across different sectors of the economy. Thank you.
I thank you very much for those comments and observations. I think you very much keyed into points around scale and also this question around short and long term. Again, the RMS is intended to capture sort of short-term changes over time, but the question does arise around, in particular, coping strategies and the function of VSLAs, as well as this really dynamic situation with livelihood strategies, people kind of coming in and out, expressing a desire to return to their sort of core livelihood activity once things sort of stabilize. So in the next round of the RMS, those are things we are definitely going to be keying into. And so thank you for that. We have just a few minutes left, so I want to make sure we have time for Jasmine's question, and then Tim and John, I see your hands. So over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, Karen. And mine is also more of a comment opposed to a question. It is definitely going in alignment with what has been mentioned in terms of trust, in terms of building that trust, in terms of how we do that in development, and also how we do that as we collaborate with the government. And as we've transitioned recently into this new administration, many things have changed that have extremely impacted the economy here in Nigeria, which includes the floating of the Forex and the removal of the fuel subsidies that we recently experienced. They've made an extreme impact on the economy and also on how we look at the work that we're doing. What I really wanted to mention is as we look at new administrations in any country, we hope that the words that are said are things that are actually put into action. And recently, on July 13th, the president of Nigeria, President Tinubu, he announced a declaration on food insecurity, or food security. So his declaration of an emergency on food security, it lists about 11 points that he plans to put into action to make the food security system more effective. That includes irrigation, that includes mechanization, that includes the Ministry of Ag working closely with the Ministry of Water and Resources. And it was many things that were mentioned. And as all people look at new administrations with hope and a little lack of trust, my hope and my deepest hope is these points that are mentioned go into place. He also mentioned about creating better access to finance. And if these things happen in alignment with what we're discussing right here today, a lot of change can happen. And that change could actually really make Nigeria a very strong country in terms of agriculture, since agriculture is done by like 70 to 80% of the people who live here in Nigeria. So I just wanted to bring that to people's attention. If you guys weren't aware, the declaration that the president made on July 13th it could really substantially help some of the factors, the major factors that we have here. So we're just hoping here at the mission, and also I'm sure all my Nigerian colleagues are hoping as well that he stands by his word. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine, for bringing up that really important change in the policy context. Again, it'll be interesting to track that. The next round of RMS data collection is coming up in just the next month and following. So this could certainly be something that we dig into more deeply in the follow-on study, depending upon the timing of all this. I guess one question related to that is the extent to which there is any sort of safety net component or integration of some kind of humanitarian assistance to help families and households deal with the crisis. And again, thank you for mentioning the removal of the fuel subsidy, expecting that's going to hit people increasingly hard. So I don't know, any thoughts on that? And then over to you, Tim.
Yeah, just to follow up on the safety net piece, I think what's really coming out from the study is that it's becoming harder for the poor to participate in the markets because they just don't have the resources to do so. And we want to make sure that as the markets get developed, that we don't leave out that important group. And so one way to make sure that they participate is to maybe have some kind of a transfer that allows them to continue to buy inputs and continue to participate in the market so that they can get back on their feet. I think if we don't have some kind of a transfer like that and people are kind of left on their own, then I think the market will eventually lose that portion of the population that I think that they want to have participate. So it's really important. That was related to the comment that Mark made about market demand is going down on that with that group of the population. So I think it's really important. And the fact that we don't see any food assistance or any kind of cash transfers going on with that group in this area, even though the FuseNet and our data are all pointing that food insecurity is getting worse and selling off productive assets is getting worse. It's kind of critical to make sure something happens. Over.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone for comments and questions during this session. I've noted in the chat box, we will be taking your written questions as well as verbal questions and doing our best to respond to those in a written form that will circulate together with the slide deck and a recording of this session. Now I see some have some in the chat box have indicated they've got some outstanding questions. Please feel free to send those to us over the next couple of days. And again, we'll do our best to respond and circulate responses. Can we flip to the next slide, as I know we are on time? Just a quick update on the next steps. We're currently prepping for round 4, which again will be taking place data collection late August, early September. And then presenting an overall analysis, a comprehensive analysis from all 4 rounds of this year of RMS. So planning for that, as well as this in-depth qualitative inquiry, currently going over the data sets that we have and questions and hypotheses that have come out of this research so that we can dig more deeply into those in the follow-on component. So the final slide, again, just offers our email addresses in case you don't have them already. So if you're not able to pose those questions that you have during this session, we'll watch for those in our inbox. We'd like to send out something by next week that can respond to any of these outstanding questions, as well as things that were raised during the session. So again, thank you everyone for your input and contributions and the opportunity to share, I think, these pretty critical findings about what's happening in the Northeast. Also, final note from Emily Marshall in the chat, we do have an evaluation. As always, we want to hear from you, thoughts on how this session has gone and what you'd like to see in the future. So thanks, everyone.